us tonight. It is our great pleasure tonight to welcome Dr. Sabrina Jafrali, who is going to tell us more around the history and importance of Black spaces in Canada. So as it was mentioned, the webinar will be recorded and shared on our social media platforms, so like Facebook, YouTube, and our website. So we encourage you all to widely share it with your networks because you know it's going to be amazing. So the timing of the event, they will last about an hour, followed by 20-minute, 30-minute question period. And we want also to provide land acknowledgement. So in an effort to bring anti-colonial practices to the space, we'd like to start by acknowledging that our work in Tiohtià:ke, Montreal, takes place on the unceded indigenous lands of the Kanien'kehá:ka Mohawk Nation. Kanien'kehá:ka is known as a gathering place for many First Nations, and we recognize the Kanien'kehá:ka as custodians of the lands and waters on which we gather today. One of the ways that systems perpetuate discrimination is through the passing down of taken for granted norms and narratives through generations. Hence why it is so important for us to bring counter narratives into the space. So our much esteemed speaker today, Dr. Sabrina Jafrali, is an educator, co-founder of the Center for Religious Literacy, and a social justice advocate. She has led an impressive career as a secondary school teacher at Westmount High School, like the many shout outs that we saw in the chat. And she's also a university course lecturer at McGill University in the Faculty of Education. In 2018, she received the Prime Minister's Award for Teaching Excellence. Her research includes pedagogy, anti-racist and anti-Blackness education, religious literacy, and purposeful dialogue. Beyond her teaching and research activities, Dr. Jafrali is a dedicated activist, and in 2020, she was recognized as Activist of the Year by BuyBlack.com. So for tonight, in this webinar, Dr. Jafrali will discuss the lack of spaces in Canada for Black people and how those missing or disappearing spaces impact the lives of Black Canadians. She will also provide a historical overview of prominent Black spaces in Canada. In doing so, Dr. Jafrali will take us on a coast-to-coast journey of Black spaces, starting in Nova Scotia with the story of Africville, and ending in British Columbia's ethnically diverse Hogan's Alley. This webinar has been made possible through the sponsorship from McGill University Labor Law and Development Research Laboratory. So before I hand it over to Dr. Jafrali, I'm just going to remind everyone that if you have questions, please add them in the chat box. And then during the question period, we will ask the questions to our guest speaker. So the floor is yours, Dr. Jafrali.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Julie and Balarama and Montreal in Action, Lexi. Thank you all for this invitation and for the opportunity. And thank you to all of you who have joined us via webinar today to talk about these important spaces. I love the fact that we've already started with a territorial acknowledgement, and this is going for across Canada. This one is specifically for Montreal. And of course, we always want to recognize counter dialogues in our system in our country. Sorry, for just technical purpose, can I ask you to mute yourself? Because I can hear the echo feedback. Perfect, thank you so much. I want to recognize the CCRL team. This is the Center for Civic Religious Literacy. And we look at religious literacy across Canada. We use a very special skill set that looks at local contextualized information and local researchers in the area. We don't presume to know what people need in Vancouver if we're living in Montreal and vice versa. And so this is a brief picture of our team. And if you'd like to know more, the website is ccrl-clrc.ca. Oh, okay. Oh, some technical, there we go. And this is me. As you know, I am Dr. Sabrina Jafrali. I always consider myself a human first. My pronouns are she and her. I do consider myself a person of color, an educator and an activist. And those of you who follow me on Instagram under my pseudonym, I'm also known as the Bold Disruptor, which you act local, think global. So One thing that we're going to do today is we're going to anchor this conversation in a religious literacy framework. So you might think, oh, it's religion. In our religious literacy framework, we're anchoring an approach that understands diversity, whether it's in a religious, spiritual, non-religious, moral, or other worldview traditions. And in this case, we're going to be looking at the spiritual, non-religious, and other worldview traditions. We recognize the changing nature of religious, spiritual, non-religious, moral, and other worldviews traditions, and how they are influenced by social, political, economic, and cultural spheres of society. So essentially, how does our worldview get impacted by the society, the politics, the economics, and the cultural aspects? We understand and we recognize that each spiritual, non-religious, moral, and other worldview traditions from its own perspective. And we do not look at it from a perspective of our own, but rather we try to acknowledge the perspective from the perspective they're in. So for example, we don't try to apply a Western dominant narrative to an indigenous narrative and vice versa. So we recognize this. Lastly, but we won't be speaking about it today, is to recognize the indigenous spirituality. And I have to put that in quotations within a discussion of spiritual overall and that understanding of its basis on the terms and perspective of indigenous communities in Canada. So we are going to focus on 1, 2, and 3, approach to non-religious, moral, other worldviews among individuals and groups, to recognize the changing nature of people's thoughts and minds and their worldviews, how we see things and how they change, and how those changing of our worldviews come about through economics, culture, and social impacts. What are these impacts that have on our worldviews and how do they change it? Worldviews are organic, they're not static, so they're always changing. And so that's how we're gonna look at this conversation tonight. One thing that Julie, oh, I keep going back, there we go. Julie had us going from Halifax to Nova Scotia. I decided to do a reverso. We're actually gonna start in Vancouver and we're gonna end up in Halifax. So I've given us a beautiful map of our country. And as you can see here on the left-hand side, it's Black urban spaces or urban Black spaces. The reason why I did this, because I want people to know that historically we do have other spaces in Canada that are historically recognized. For example, in Ontario, we have the concept of Uncle Tom's Cabin that's there. So I don't want you to think that there are only 3 places that are for Black people or historically are dated to Black folks in Canada. We've been here a very long time. So for this purpose of this webinar, we're going to be looking at urban spaces. So starting with Vancouver and Hogan's Alley, which we would call the soul. It's been seen as the soul of Vancouver. We're going to be looking at the NCC in Montreal, Quebec, right where I am right now, down the street from me. And we're going to be ending in the heart, which is Halifax, Africville, for those of you who don't know that. So we're going to the soul, the spirit, and the heart. So if we're all ready, Julie, is there anything in the chat? Everything is good? Excellent. Okay, so let's look at the soul. This is Hogan's Alley. This is Vancouver, BC. And the one thing that people are often surprised or ask are there Black folks there? Of course there are Black folks there. We are everywhere. So Hogan's Alley is the little area here that's in Strathcona. It's near Chinatown. It sits between the Georgia Viaduct. And it was an area that was called a Hogan's Alley. This is a very interesting term for Hogan's Alley. It's actually not a name or a title, it's a reference. It goes back to the time when the Irish were living in New York in Hell's Kitchen. And it's synonymous with ghetto. So I suppose it's maybe an upgraded way of saying ghetto, but it was called a Hogan's Alley. What we know it as for our Black people in Canada is a Black Strathcona. This is an area where we see the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. So let's talk a little bit about the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. I'm very sorry, if someone is unmuted, could you please mute yourself? Because the distraction is continuous, my apologies. So the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, and we'll see them again later in Montreal, but this was a way of Black people who worked on trains. This wasn't some menial job at the time. This was a good job. People who were able to travel, people who were able to bring their music and talent, and they created a neighborhood. This is why we believe that Hogan's Alley came about. Because if you look at the map down there, you'll see that it's right on the railway. There's a Union Station. There's the National Pacific line from the Americas. So this was a way, the end of the line for porters to take a nap, and they built a neighborhood, a Black neighborhood around there. So that's how we know Hogan's Alley was there. It was existing. The Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters were there, and it was a good job at this time. Hogan's Alley, or Black Strathcona, was also known as a musical mecca. Many people don't realize that Vancouver was considered the Hollywood of the North. When I did the research, I couldn't believe it myself. We had great people who came into Black Strathcona, like Count Basie, Duke Ellington, Ella Fitzgerald, and famously known in Black Strathcona, the Crump Twins, people who were there. So this was a place where people would stop, pay attention, and perform. They would do that here at Hogan's Alley. Hogan Alley is also known for Black entrepreneurship. There were Black businesses. This little area that you see in red on the map had a number of Black businesses. If you were done a show and you were Ella Fitzgerald and you needed to eat, you went to Vi's Chicken and Steaks. This was a place where people would sit down, they would have a good time, they would eat till 2, 3 in the morning. So this was a vibrant, growing area. Most people also know Hogan's Alley for Fountain Chapel Church because it's associated with a famous musician. Jimi Hendrix's grandmother, Nora Hendrix, was the founder of the Fountain Chapel Church. It's an area, again, that was built up by us, for us. So when people ask, were there Black people in Vancouver? Well, of course, we've been there since the 1800s, and we had many good things going. What ends up happening in Vancouver is something that is called the blight. Now, when you look at the word blight, it's like a decay. The way Vancouver, the city of Vancouver described it, they described Hogan's Alley as a disease, something that had to be cut out, something that had to be eliminated. Why this was happening? Because people were starting to move out of the city and this suburbia life was growing. And of course, we know what happens in urban areas where Black folks live. They want to make a highway. They need transportation. People want to be in cars. So we have this growing vector happening between people wanting to move out of the city and these people living in an area, and we have this blight. And if you look at Vancouver, there's a number of commercials that talk about this blight, the blight of Vancouver. So we see this systematic, governmental, systematic way of destroying a neighborhood, which we will later see in Africville as well. And so this continues to happen. What's interesting about Hogan's Alley in comparison to Africville and Montreal is the activism. I don't know if the city of Vancouver counted on people being active. This is the 1960s. People systematically shut down this highway. It's called the activism of Vancouver. That's why Hogan's Alley is known as the soul of Vancouver, because activism was the one thing that kept Hogan's Alley alive for as long as it was. Eventually, the multicultural society, Hogan's Alley got smaller and smaller. And a little bit later on, we'll talk about how they're reviving it. Julie, I want to ask, are there any questions in the chat?
Nope. You're all good.
We're good? Perfect. Oh. So let's move to the East Coast now. So we know what's going on in Hogan's Alley. They fought it, even though they were considered a blight, a disease, but this foundational entrepreneurship, this Hollywood of the North, this activism, Canadian activism, slowed down the redevelopment, the urbanization, what I would call the government systemic desire to kill a neighborhood is slowed down. So let's move to Montreal. What's happening in Montreal? And Montreal seems to be in the news a lot lately, Montreal and Ottawa. So we'll get to that in a second. Well, we have the NCC, the Negro Community Center. We cannot mention the NCC and not talk about Union United Church. Union United Church is one of the oldest foundational Black churches in Canada. And I would like to say that Reverend S. put a call out and there was a response. In the living room of Reverend Charles S., they come together and they decide, what do we need? We're talking about early 1900s. What do we need? And what we need is a space for ourselves. So this call for Black spaces is not something new. It's not a 2020. This has been happening for 100, 150 years. They decide that this call and response, the response was the building of the NCC, was a way to humanize their existence. We already know at this time that the Colored Women's Club is operating in Montreal, and it still exists today in Montreal. And again, do you remember I told you we were going to see the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters again from Vancouver? They're now here again in Montreal. So these ideas of Black spaces are exchanging themselves, because in Vancouver, remember, they're traveling. They're stopping in Toronto. They're stopping in Montreal. They're stopping in Nova Scotia. They're conversing. They're dialoguing. And they're saying, hey, we need this. And so we see that the Brotherhood is having a conversation coast to coast because we're on the rails. So in 1927, it's a very small setup. It's done in rented rooms across Little Burgundy. Of course, there was Rufus Rockheads, the club there. And these little things are happening. It's not until later on that it merges itself and becomes the NCC, the building that you see on the left-hand side of the screen. In this building is an abundance of services available. We have tutoring, piano, tap dancing, cooking. And of course, it's most famously known for raising up people like Oliver Jones and Oscar Peterson. But those are just two of many. We have many people who have come through the NCC and remember it clearly, very clearly, taking their children there, having a place to call home. And then, of course, we have the government. This is what I would call a forced decline. As the government decides again that they're going to relocate, they're going to urbanize, we see that people start to leave this area. And then the NCC falls more and more in decline. If you take a notice, I want you to take a look around your neighborhoods. I can't guarantee it, but there's almost a highway in all Black neighborhoods. It's a way of geographically dividing things. So we see this forced decline coming about. But the NCC hangs on. It has history. It has importance. And it's so important that when Nelson Mandela comes and visits Montreal, the NCC is the place where he is welcome to, our Black space, the NCC for us. And this happens. It's a great monumental moment. But then at this time, the neglect sets in. The building is not taken care of. The programming is different. Things are different. Our community needs are different. And again, we're going to talk about that a little bit later. And unfortunately, in 2000s, the wall falls. It gets destroyed. They have no choice but to sell it off, and it's demolished. The current situation at the NCC is we want it back. I'm going to be very clear about that. We want it back. It's been bought by a developer who's offering an outrageous amount for it back, but it's ours and we want it back. So that's the NCC. Let's go to, oh, no, perfect. Let's go to Nova Scotia. And here we have the Africville community. Arguably, probably the most famous of the Black spaces that we're going to talk about today. Africville is in this area in Halifax. Halifax is the capital city, and Africville is on this great land. Many people think it's a small area, but it's part of a bigger land. Africville is unique in the sense that William Brown and William Arnold in 1848. So let's be clear historically here. Canada is not a country yet. Canada becomes a country July 1st, 1867. Slavery has just finished in the British Empire. And it's not completely finished. For those of you who may not know this, but slavery still continues internally in British colonies. So you couldn't buy new slaves, but you could keep and trade and buy the slaves you had. In the United States, as you know, it's a different story. In 1848, upon British invitation, William Brown and William Arnold buy land. I want to pause there for a moment in case the chat goes crazy, Julie. January 3rd, 1848, two Black men buy land. I want that to sink in for a moment. That is avant-garde. We're barely out of slavery, and yet we have the opportunity, these two men have the opportunity to buy land, to own it, right? Not given, not squatting, bought. That's why I call them pioneer landowners. Because in 1848, let's be honest, we weren't buying much, but this land has been bought. These two men are these pillars, these foundational, inspirational people who build a town. They build a town. They don't build their two houses and that's it. It's a town. It's a place. It's a district. It's part of the district of Halifax. They build a town. They owned land. People rent. There's stores. There's a church. There's places to be. You come into Africville, or as it was known then, Campbell Road Settlement, and you're settled. This is home. I would even go as far as to say it's almost like a pre-Atlanta. We had our own Atlanta in Canada. And we built, we toiled it. And I really need to stress that. We toiled it. We put our blood, our sweat, our money, our economic power into a town that we built. Many people would like to think that the church is really the foundation of Africville. I would argue that it's the very land. It's the very fact that we bought this land before Canada even becomes a country that makes Africville so monumental and can tell us a lot. The first church is not the church that we see today standing in Africville. It's actually the Zion Church. That was the first church. It's not until 1854 that the Zion Church joins the African United Baptist Church to become the Campbell Road African United Church. And this church, some of the elders that I've spoken to Africville would argue was the third most important thing in Africville. Number one was the town itself. Number two was education, and then it was the church. What people don't realize is that Africville was in their fingers, in their DNA, because they built it. But of course, you're seeing a trend now. We have that favorite G word, the government. The government makes a decision, of course, that they want the land. But this is not as easy as they could do in Vancouver or in the NCC. They can't just decide to normalize or to urbanize. They have to do things that are interesting. And this is a very clear case of systemic discrimination. First, they go to the Halifax City Council and they get approval. You might be asking, oh my gosh, how come they got approval? We are still not able to sit in city council as Black people. So this legislation passing is a no-brainer, but they still can't take the land yet. Remember what I told you, we're landowners. So they decide to go to an even more like an even county legislation or provincial legislation. They need permission to take it because at this time we are the province of Nova Scotia. And they obtain legislation. But remember what I told you, we're landowners. They can't just come up and say, okay, tonight's the night, we're taking your stuff. They enact a plan that is very not unique to Canada, because we've seen it done in British Columbia when it came to Japanese internment camp. But they were systemic and systematic about it. First, it started with refusing to extend pipes into Africville. So a lot of people think they just stop the water. If a pipe is there, it's very difficult to stop a water. They actually stopped the extension of pipes to go into Africville to stop the water from getting clean water. So I just want to take a step back here. I want people to be clear. So Julie, you let me know if everyone's clear. We own the land. We're part of the city of Halifax. We are taxpayers, right? We're taxpayers. We're not squatting, we're tax paying. And the very district that's meant to serve us is the very district that's refusing to extend basic services to us. So this is very important. the roundabout sewage collection. These are the things that are happening in Halifax, in Africville, to tax-paying Canadians. Let's not forget they're also veterans, people who fought in the War of 1812, people who fought in World War I, Black people. And yet, this is what I was telling you going back to the first slide about how does economics and political and social factors impact our worldview? What impact does it have on people that you're a taxpayer and yet the government can make an arbitrary decision to say, no, we don't want you to have a pipe in your neighborhood? Oh, sorry, can someone put themselves on mute? Thank you. So this is what happens. Eventually, through wearing down and the reduction of services, and simply just because there's no Black representation, the relocation happens. We know that the relocation happens in two ways. Those who are landowners in Africville, they buy elsewhere, and the renters get relocated. A lot of people think that the areas, which we call in Halifax, the pubs or the park or Uniacke Square, were built specifically for Africville residents. Part of that is true and part of that is coincidental. At this time, there was a home shortage in Halifax. People were dying, people didn't have places to go. And so we see that this population of Africville is relocated. I would argue forcibly relocated to this area that was built up by the city of Halifax, not just for Africville residents, because of the shortage in general. But what's interesting about Africville, if we go back to the living hearts, if we go back to the toiling of the land, Africville is, everyone is a living heartbeat, from its descendants to its founders. What makes Africville maintain itself is every person who is a descendant of Africville is essentially a walking, living witness to Africville and to what was done. So this is what's happening in Africville. So, and of course, we're going to talk about how they resurrected. Julie, are there any questions at this time? Okay. So I want to take a moment to talk about the spiritual centers that are in these three places. If you see this arrow below, it's a little blue arrow. That is the Fountain Chapel Church that was started by Nora Kendrick in Vancouver. If you look at Union United, that's in Montreal, it's still standing here today. And this is the church that stands today as the Africville Church in Halifax, Nova Scotia. And these churches play a foundational role in helping Black spaces maintain themselves. Although the church in Vancouver is not functional, it is recognized, and Union is still standing, and the Africville Church is still standing. At this time, we're going to move into fighting for our spaces. So I've given you a little bit of history, why it's important. I mean, we didn't even need this history to know why it's important, but it's important to talk about it. Let's go back to Hogan's Alley, the importance of safeguarding our spaces, fighting for our spaces. In Vancouver, if you want to do more research, there's the Hogan's Alley Society. They have 3 projects going right now. One is the Black Cultural Center, where they're going to take up a block and commemorate Black culture. They have the Metro Vancouver Regional District Black Experience, where they're going to take data and document the experience of Black Vancouverites. And in Vancouver and Seattle, they have the Nora Kendrick Place, which is housing, temporary housing for people. And the reason it's necessary to fight for these spaces is because we are here. It's interesting that if you look at history books across Canada, you won't see this history in our books, but this narrative will never be erased. It's here, it's present. And unless we know about it, unless we mention it and we discuss it, we fight for it, then it will disappear. In Vancouver, their avenue of fighting is through creating a historical narrative of Hogan's Alley. putting commemorations up, the Black Culture Center, taking data on the experiences, creating a Hogan Alley Society. They're not only fighting for what was there, but they're ensuring that it's maintained there and their experiences are there. Let's move to the NCC. The NCC is about reimagining our space. There's currently a committee called the Revive the NCC, and we recently had another event called the Long Walk Home on August 1st, which is the Emancipation Day for Black peoples across British colonies. People like Victor Paris, David Sheldon, Tiffany Callender are trying to ensure the legacy of the NCC. I would argue that it's time to reimagine this space. One of the shortcomings that we have in reviving the NCC, and this is where we have to discuss as family here, people, one of the issues that we're having is it cannot be what it was. It's not an area like Hogan's Alley. It's a building that served us. So we need to start reimagining our spaces. What do they want? What do we want them to be? What should they be? How can they serve us? How can they serve the diversity within us? So we need to start reimagining. I also imagine the NCC as bridging communities. In Montreal, if you know things about Montreal, we have two unique communities within communities. We have a Black Anglophone community, and within there are many other types of communities. We have a Black Anglo-Caribbean, we have an African Nova Scotian community, we have an African Canadian community, we have an African diaspora community, and then we have our French brothers and sisters. We have a Black Francophone community, a Haitian community, African French speaking communities. So there are communities within communities. And I see us reimagining our spaces as a bridging of these communities. Let's no longer be divided by geographical or linguistic terms, but rather reimagine a space where we can come together and break bread, where we can talk, where we can offer services, where we can have conversations with each other, rather than letting a bridge, a metro station, or a language divide us. So let's reimagine the NCC. But this takes work. This takes putting aside a lot of things, putting aside egos, putting aside differences. And that's where I want to move into Africville. Keeping our spaces alive. I suppose on some levels this is bias, and I have to show my bias right now. My aunt, Deborah Dixon, is one of the founders of the Africville Reunion, one of the ways of maintaining spaces in Nova Scotia, in Halifax, across Canada. I do believe it's a successful model, but the question is, why did she do it? How did she keep spaces alive? Besides the fact that I told you Africville, every person was the living, walking heartbeat, that we were avant-garde, that we land owned. My aunt had a very clear idea that people need to know who they are and need to be connected. So I'm going to say that again. People need to know their genealogy. They need to know who they are, who they're connected to. And so she sat down on a park bench and made a decision that she was going to have an Africville reunion. This is even before Africville was restored and given back or taken back by Africville residents. She sat down in the early 60s and 70s and made a decision that she wanted to have a space, a time, and a place for descendants of Africville to come together to remember their town. This was important to document, to note, to record, to put our stamp, to brand that land, to know that we are here. And she did this with my other aunt, Brenda Steed Ross, and their friend, Linda Mantley. She went to them, she fundraised, she went to people. And in 1984, we had the first Africville reunion, one that is continued to this day, 30 odd years later. That very grit of wanting to maintain, wanting to know where you come from, what are your roots, are things that I see that need to happen in all of our spaces. We need grit to maintain spaces. We need to be able to fight. We need to record. We need to stamp. We need to brand that we are here. The Africville Reunion, I would argue, bled into and inspired the Africville Genealogical Society. which at that time the president was Irving Carvery. And the Geological Society, 8 years after the first Africville reunion, started to decide that they were going to petition the government to apologize for what they did. Remember, this was a government who made a decision to systematically deny paying tax citizens their services. And in 1992, this fight was taken on and successfully won. At the time in Africville, a couple of years later, we know that the city of Halifax apologized. They gave reparations to a certain extent because that money is distributed in different ways. It built up Africville and the church and the land. And we decided to fight. So this is not to say that there are not areas that we cannot hold people accountable. When a government decides that they're going to urbanize, and I say that very sarcastically, urbanize an area and displace a community, we as taxpaying citizens have rights to be here and to have our spaces. The question is, how do we go about it? We reimagine, we fight, maintain, brand, name. We don't let it go. We also don't let our differences get involved. We're always going to have differences, but ultimately we have to have a goal. And for my aunts and their friend, there was a goal to maintain who we are, this land that we built. And I would argue that the NCC and Hogan's Alley have the same foundation. We built that. Vi's Chicken and Steaks was built. The NCC was built. Our roots are there. Our DNA is there. Our spiritual community DNA is there, and we need to record it. What's equally interesting is that they built the George Dixon Center in Halifax, Nova Scotia, dedicated to probably one of the best boxers we know in Canada, who also was an Africville resident. So one lesson that I would like to see us take from Africville is that unrelentless desire to stamp that we are here. I would even argue to tattoo the land, that we are here and we are not to be dismissed. At this time, I'm open for questions, Julie.
So we do have one
Okay.
about, so when you say we are here, how do we reconcile being heavily recognized in pop culture, yet denied recognition in the demographic or financial aspect?
Okay,
it's
so
it's like being hidden in plain sight.
It's being hidden, exactly. I think what's really important to the person, sorry, can I get their name? I like to address them by name.
Of course, it was by Tanya.
Okay, by Tanya. So Tanya, thank you so much for your question. I think you point out a very interesting thing. So two things. We're here, but are we controlling the narrative of we are here? At this time, the narrative is not controlled by us. We don't have media outlets, or I shouldn't say that. We don't have sufficient amount of media outlets to control our narrative. We're not in positions to create our Black narrative in Canada. So instead, we are victim to a narrative that's created to us, by us, not for us, but by others for us. But I would say, Tanya, it's time that we stop sulking in the corner about what people are saying about us and we start stamping. The same way that the Hogan's Alley Society is doing a revival movement and making sure Hogan Alley is recognized, the same way the NCC were marching out there to ensure the space is there, the same way my aunt sat on a bench and decided she was going to record descendants of Africville, is the same way we need to start offering counter-dominant narratives of who we are. We are not rappers, or not simply rappers. We are not simply entertainers. We are more than that. And it's time to note those. So I would say we need to control the narratives and create opportunities to create our own medias and our own narratives for that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So this was the question in the chat. So one question is also how do we make sure that we're going to keep those black spaces alive, right? Like, so what can we do for for this generation, the next, to make sure that history does not repeat itself ultimately?
I think this comes down to having a conversation with ourselves as family. And I say family because there are people, you know, family is not people you choose. It's just people who you're related to. And that's just what it is. Fundamentally, this starts with us. We have differences. We have different perspectives. But we have to ask a question. Is being in your perspective more important than making sure that people know we're here? I think we need to ask ourselves that question. There are a lot of people I don't get along with. There are a lot of people I disagree with. But when it comes down to the work, when it comes down to the foundation, I think of William Brown and William Arnold. Did they always get along? I don't know. I don't know. They maybe had different visions of what it should look like. Did, you know, Nora Hendricks disagree with people when she was building Fountain Chapel Church? I'm sure. When the NCC was being laid out, did they have differences? I'm sure. But does those differences mean more than building a space that allows us to declare we are here? I don't want my sole foundational knowledge in Canada to be Uncle Tom's Cabin. That's not what I want. We have a rich history, so we have to make decisions amongst us family. What are we willing to fight for, and what are we willing to put aside to ensure our longevity and the sustainability of our spaces? So thank you for that question.
So another question here from Hannah is to ask if there are any texts you would recommend checking out to gain a more thorough understanding of the history of Black communities in Canada.
Thank you, Hannah, for so much. To be honest, Hannah, it's kind of like hidden jewels, so to speak. I definitely have the slides on the next page here. So there's some slides that I've presented, some places that you can go to and check. A lot of the Africville was speaking to elders, people who were still alive or descendants. Hogan's Alley Society, the Hogan's Alley Project, they're really, really good. And start there and ask around. People have pictures. People just want to be asked. I'm not quite sure now if the Trump twins are still alive, Hannah, but they performed in Hogan's Alley. They were quite old at the time of the video, but they're still alive. But we have elders amongst us that you can ask. You know, what's interesting is that when you look at other cultures' history, they record their elders. We need to record our elders. We need to talk to people. And that's one thing, like I said, and I don't, please don't consider me biased. I don't want to be my aunt pusher, but she recorded. She got families together and recorded our history. It's very important. It's important that we start researching. You know, I'm never a Wikipedia fan, but sometimes in Wikipedia, if you go to their bibliography, you catch a jewel, do some research, ask people. We have living elders right now. For me, they're the best source right now because they were there and you can ask, right? So you can start with my slides, ask, talk to people. David Austin has put out a great book about Black Montreal. These are places that the literature is out there. Thank you. Sorry, so I think we want to put somebody on mute, right, Julie? Thank you. Is there another question, Julie?
Not in the chat. So if someone has a question, please write it down. You can also give a shout out if you want. we do have a couple saying thank you so much. It was very interesting. And Donalda is actually mentioned that connection to our ancestor and the land to develop is important for having a strong foundation of self.
Absolutely.
I'm
very open to questions. I wanted it to be more interactive. I didn't want to be the lecturer. So please let's share, let's have conversations. Let's talk about this. Let's do some, we're actually creating a Black space right now. We're talking about it, we're creating it, we're doing it. So let's do this together. Oh, let's go back. Will you be giving recommendations for the beginning of historical Black communities that are not currently celebrated? So the first place I would start for Hogan's Alley is the Hogan's Alley Society. They've done a good job at documenting their history. And the Hogan's Alley Project that I would encourage you to get involved. You can donate, you can become a member very easily. For NCC, I would definitely look at Dave Austin's book. It's on my references. Dave Austin writes about I think it's called, it's on my slide here. Race, Sex, and Security in the 60s in Montreal. Very, very good book. For Africville, again, there's a lot of information there about Africville, but in Africville, you could start with the Geological Society. You can start talking to people who are from there. I'm sure there's many people here from Nova Scotia who are on the line. You can have conversations because the elders and the descendants of Africville are still alive. And that's what you saw. And then there's other ones, right? There's historical, other places. So other places are well documented. We can go into Ontario. We can start looking at Ontario books. But the point is, Tamara, we don't have enough data. We don't have enough books written. That's what we have to start doing. We have to start documenting. We haven't started that process as a community, documenting space by space. We haven't documented the whole history of Hogan's Alley. We haven't documented Black people in Saskatchewan. We haven't, but there are Black history tours. We know we have here in Montreal, but these are tours. If we want to start building a Canadian Black library, that's exactly where we need to go. That's what we need to start looking at. Because again, you're asking for things and we should have it. But this is why we fundamentally have to start putting together. I also know there's the Black Studies Society in Canada, where they can have a lot of resources, but we need a library that if somebody clicks on it, you can find what you need. That's creating a Black space.
Yeah, we have a question from Andrea as well.
Yes.
And she's wondering that, like, if in your studies, history surrounding the immediate neighborhoods around McGill, often referred to as the McGill Ghetto, how might we understand this in the context and proximity to McGill with the legacy of our university and the connection to the
word ghetto? I mean, Andrea, you know that McGill and ghetto, these are just two oxymoronic words right now, and they're in trouble, right? I mean, McGill very much, I mean, my understanding that there's supposed to be some remedying of the name. I'm not even sure if McGill will be willing to give up their name, but that's a whole other webinar. But we know the foundational history of James McGill being a former slave owner. And I'm realizing now, Andrea, it's dawned on me a couple weeks ago that every degree I have, or 2 out of the 3 have McGill. And I'm almost like, oh, I don't know if I like that, right? I'm not sure if I like that. So we have to look at that concept of how do we frame McGill properly, and how do we acknowledge the whole narrative of McGill? And ghettoization, we know, is a very old concept that comes from the time of looking at ghettoization of Jews across Eastern Europe. The thought of putting people in a certain area to control them. And that area has definitely, it's happened all across Canada. We see it's almost happened to, I can't say this confidently, but almost every group of color in Canada on some level has been ghettoized, right? So it's very interesting how we're looking at the etymology of our words and the historical narrative of our words, because now we're interested in the spaces that they're creating. They're interesting. So I hope that helps. I'm still with you there, Andrea. I'm not sure I'm ready to take my degrees down yet because I earned them, but at the same time, I don't know what I'm gonna do with the name. I'm not sure.
I understand. I do have a degree from McGill too. Karma here says that he's asking, how can we engage different levels of government in the discourse on African spaces?
Oh, okay, let me see. How do we engage different? Okay, that's a big question you're asking, Karma, because we have to remember something. Provincially, education, it belongs to the provinces. And then there's the federal situation. So, and then we have to start, and I've talked about this recently on a podcast called Running with the Wolves and Morning Detour at CKUT. We need to start putting our vote forward, putting our power voter, our currency forward to change things. So do you remember when I said, Karma, like, how does this happen to people who are economically tax paying? Remember, how does worldviews get impacted by social, economic, and political situations? I pay my taxes, but yet I'm not reflected in a curriculum. Let's sit that there for a minute. I pay my taxes, but I'm not in the curriculum. In the present, right now in Montreal, today I've been doing a lot of news interviews because there's a history book that's in Montreal, that's in Quebec, that has the N-word outrightly. And nobody saw it, and nobody decided that it was a bad thing. Actually, the quote we got was, well, there was no complaints about it. But yet I pay. So I pay for you to traumatize me, essentially. So let's start provincially. Provincially, we vote. I really need us to become politically literate, to come together to create communal demands. Communal demands like a voting block, and make sure that our numbers and voting power is strong. That's number one. We may be 3% of the population, but we can make some noise when we're ready. So that's one. Number two is our economic dollars. We don't want to spend in this area if we don't want to. So that's provincial level. When you start voting, right? When you start exercising your voting power, you get to start making our demands. Because on education, it's not going to change. I'm a teacher. It doesn't matter if I like it or not. I don't have power as a teacher. The power lies with parents, voters, and the government. So I actually need your help, Karma, for you to take your voting and your political literacy and change a curriculum that's reflective of all of us. We have these resources available to us now. We have Dr. Dorothy Williams, who created the Black History of ABCs. I think Akila Newton is here on the line tonight. She created something for elementary level big dreamers. The resources are there. The government is not engaging. So we need to demand for them to engage. That's what we need to, that's on a provincial level. On a federal level, we see it's happening a little bit more, right? We've seen the money that came through for Black businesses. But again, voting block power, we need to make ourselves known. Secondly, we also need to have seats at the table. Unfortunately, and I say this with love for my job, Karma, but I'm only a teacher. And I say only because I'm going to tell you why. I don't have a professional recognition in this province. I'm not considered a professional. I've been doing this job for 20 years. Secondly, I have no right to comment on the reforms in the government. Okay, so this is a problem and it needs to be dealt with. So I would start saying it's time for us to be in powers that make a difference. Karma, if you're living in a district, run for city councillor. Why don't we become members of parliament? Why aren't we in MAAs? We have to start doing those things. Why some of us need to be on the Ministry of Education. We need to demand pedagogical expertise. That's one of the demands I made tonight. Why did the N-word get through 5 people and still get published? 5 different types of people, 5 different groups seen it, and nobody thought it was bad. So we need somebody at the Ministry of Education to check it, to say, oh, no, let's stop here in the line of production. This is wrong. This is wrong. We need to be in strategic positions, right? We need to go into every position, politics, civic rights, everything, and start making our voice known. It's no longer, we can no longer be happy with the picket fence, with the house and the dog and the 2.4 children. We need more. And I need you to help me with that. Because as a teacher, like I said, I have no rights. So I hope that answers your question. Oh, I see many more, Julie.
Yes. So the next question is from Jessica, and she's asking if you could talk a little bit about the relationship between the keeping alive and reimagining the Black spaces and Indigenous land back movements, either practically in terms of theorizing land justice.
Well, thank you so much, Jessica. And you know, that's a whole other webinar that Balarama and I could talk at another time. But I believe as Black people, we have a different conceptualization of land, one that perhaps could be in line with the way our Indigenous family sees it too. And that's really important because when I look at Africville, I realized they had a different relationship with land. It wasn't just ownership. They spilled hopes in it, right? When they toiled, it was hopes. And that's what I think belief kept Africville alive. I would love to see Black people and Indigenous people discussing the concept of land and their relationship to land and how do we own it? That's not about owning, but how do we mutually care for it and it cares for us. So it's not just about keeping us alive. It's about how do we honor the land that allowed us to grow? And how do we repay, how do we create this mutual ecosystem of Black and indigeneity that helped us grow? This little land in Hogan's Alley, no bigger than the alleyway behind my house, built a community. The NCC, a little block. Africville, a little town. But I believe there's a reconception. There was a different understanding of land for Black folks. And I think it's the same thing we have now. We need to reimagine how we want things to be and speak to others who are also in that fight with us. When I say Black lives matter, Indigenous lives matter too. Indigenous missing women's murdered matter. All of this matters because we are not represented. We are not, I'm sorry, Jessica, this is a bad word. We are not stamped. If we don't have these conversations right now that are being provided to us, we could disappear. We could disappear, right? We could disappear. And so we need to have conversations. We need to talk in our community. We need to talk in the Indigenous community. And then we need to come together and have a conversation amongst family and say, hey, you know, what are we going to do together? And I know there was a comment about putting together Indigenous Black communities. If you have those connections, I'm very open to them, please. So in practical terms, I think we need to start having those conversations. I feel like as Black folks, we don't have enough conversations. And that's very indicative of the lack of Black space. We need to have conversations. We need to be amongst ourselves and figure things out. What's going on? You know, what's going on? We need to have conversations and then talk about how do we keep ourselves on the land? How do we keep ourselves in the narrative? We are in the DNA of this country, and yet we're not recognized, right? But we pay taxes, so it's interesting. But so that's my practical terms. We need to have these conversations and get together and strategically plan ourselves. I'm thinking of a Games of Thrones, like, you know, where the dragon lady sets herself up and sends out all that. That's how I think. I think like a chess player. It's time to strategically put ourselves out. So that would be my practical first step, Jessica. We need to have conversations amongst ourselves and figure things out amongst us as family.
Thank you for this answer. And I guess on the same topic of having conversations in family and in the community, Gail is asking how to continue this conversation with children because she's engaging with her family around this topic, and her 12-year-old finds it very interesting, but I guess she's trying to find to know what type of resources she can provide.
Well, hi Gail, how are you? And hello to David as well. I would suggest starting with the resources that are available to us. I think Akila Newton's on the line. If she is, we have the Big Dreamers. We have the resources ourselves. We have the ABCs of Black History by Dr. Dorothy William. We have Dave Austin, but it also means educating yourself. You know what, when this COVID is over, wouldn't it be awesome to have a Black tour across Canada and see all the sites? I'm just putting that out there. Anyone who's financially able, wouldn't it be amazing for us to have a caravan tour across Canada, starting from Hogan's Alley or Africville and go through every province and mark our spot? That's also teaching. Wouldn't that be great? Right? Wouldn't that be great? That would be something too. So I would start those conversations about the resources that we have, for example, like the Big Dreamers. Have those conversations like the resources I've put on this page for you. Have the conversations by talking to your elders. Having and also I think it's important to introduce the Indigenous concept of land. For us, for people in the dominant narrative, it's an ownership. I see land as a communal understanding. You're giving me something, I'm giving you something back. So I would start there with Big Dreamers and so forth. And Gail, you can always message me and we can talk more about those resources.
So this seems to be the only questions that we have for the moment. So if anyone has another question.
Thank you, Akila.
Yes, thank you for sharing all the resources. So there's a lot of resources that's been shared in the chat, so you can all check them out. There's also conversations around the fact that what you presented needs to be available. I personally did not know about any of it until not too long ago. So as you said, those conversations needs to be had.
And again, I didn't want this to be a history lesson.
Mhm.
If that, it's I would call it a mise à bouche. It's a little taster,
Yeah.
right? But anyone who has money and time and ideas post-COVID, let's do the Black Tour. We have it going on in Montreal, Black Tours of Montreal. Start popping up in your local cities. And could you imagine, Julie, in a year from now, we are initiating our first Black Tour across Canada from Africville to Hogan's Alley. And we find somebody in each province to tell us. And let's get that Black library going. Let's get those resources out there. There are Black authors out there writing, right?
Yes.
I see Zoe and Tanya has her hand up.
Yeah, so Zoe here wrote a question. Do you know of any groups actively working to preserve, restore Black contribution in rural areas of Canada?
Not at the moment, but Zoe, you and I can definitely find them together. I know we have to see what's going on. Normally I focused on urban, but we know that this is a movement that's going. We know Ontario has things going outside of Toronto and outside of the city centers. We can definitely look for them. But it will be interesting to see if they're out there, because I'm sure they are. We just need to connect with them. We need to find our family, right? We need to find our family.
Tanya, I know you raised your hand.
Yes.
To ask a question.
I do, yes. Hi, Sabrina. So
Hi,
my
Tanya.
question, my question is regarding on August 1st, I was there at the walk for the NCC, and it was announced that Justin Trudeau had formally acknowledged a number of things relating to Montreal. So one, I believe, was the domestic scheme was one of them, and also August 1st as an actual holiday. So those are great. But my question is regarding nationally across Canada. Should one of the pushes that we make in order to sort of get that community and that family that you're referring to together and on the same page, force or encourage the government to continue to recognize other things that, and I don't know history enough as well, but other aspects of Canadian history that would help in that narrative that you're referring to?
Yeah, I definitely see where you're going, Tanya, because if you look at it in Africville, for example, we know that in July, there's a 10-period day where it's an Africville Reunion. And the city of Halifax understands and knows this, right? We know that Hogan's Alley is fighting for that. And so I think if we start, like I said, putting ourselves in strategic positions to push it, not just the Emancipation Day, which, you know, Tanya, I have a little bit of problems with the Emancipation Day because we weren't totally free.
Very true.
But it's not like, I don't want a holiday for another, like, oh, let's get together like a Juneteenth. This should be a day where each province, we have recognition. I don't want to just celebrate. I want to educate. So yes, I think it's important that we have dates that are in each province, not just plaques, we're more than plaques, dates, tours, historical representation from each province in spaces across Canada, because I bet you we were there. I know in Saskatchewan we were. And so I definitely think we could, I definitely know it's happened in Nova Scotia, where we know the dates that we go to the Africville Reunion. Africville is commemorated, it's January 3rd, 1848, we know that date. But we need to have more of that across Canada. But I want to mention something, Tanya, because I know you and I are very like-minded. I don't think we need to wait for people for this to make this happen. We need to do it. We need to do it. This is, I'm tired of waiting. I want to do it. So again, I'm putting this out to everybody who's on this call. If you want to do a Black Tour across Canada post-COVID, let's do this. We're not waiting for anyone. Let's do this.
I'm all in.
Same here. And Donaldo will get us a group rate.
Okay, perfect. I think Zoe had a question, right, Julie? Oh, well, we answered her.
Yes,
yes, Alice, I will definitely give you a copy of the links that I can post for sure.
Yeah, we are collecting them as they go.
Yeah. Okay, Zoe, I like it. I like it.
I believe we have a plan in the making right now during this call. Like you said, this is the beginning of a Black space, right?
Yes, we have created a Black space. And if you're not Black on this call, we welcome you in and we welcome your contributions. And we're talking amongst family right now. We are. That's what I wanted it to be, not lecture-based, interactive-based.
Yeah. Donalda has her hand raised. You had a question?
Yeah, I forgive my typing. I'm two-finger typer, so sometimes I'm hitting the wrong keys. I wanted to know, I'm studying First Peoples Studies at Concordia, and it's a whole program. When I finish, I'll have a major in that particular studies, which is wonderful. It's interesting. I love it. But when I went in, when I decided to go back to school, I was asking, is there any Black history studies that you can get a certificate? And they sent me, well, you could take history or you could take this, but there's nothing. There's nothing. And I was I was a little upset. So I was, you know, I'm a Canadian Black, born Nova Scotia, many generations, Indigenous to Canada. And there's a lot of rich history here.
Absolutely.
Rich history from Nova Scotia, the Black loyalties that came over. A lot of the Blacks that were there were from loyalties to runaway slaves to, you know.
To Jamaicans that people don't know.
But we don't have that. And every study I've done or any information, it was searching like a needle in a haystack for this information. I'm like, why? Why does it have to be that difficult?
I don't want to presume to know you, Donald, but I'm like, my mother was my historian. I feel like for African Nova Scotians, we tell each other our history. And that's what I feel is fundamentally missing for the rest of us. I know McGill is looking at restructuring their African studies program to include a Black studies. And I know the universities are talking about Black studies program, but I would go even back than that, Donella. I would look at, why isn't this already in an inclusive education history curriculum? Do you, and I saw Zoe's comment, I don't know if people know that it's just recent that residential schools have been recognized in in history books. Okay. This total stain on Canadian history. And it's just now. It's just now. I went to ROS. I didn't know about it then. Zoe mentions in the comic that 2 people only knew about Africville, right? So we're missing money. And let's not forget the fact that our terminology in Canada is still not inclusive. We still use the word pâté chinois, which is derogatory to our Asian communities. We don't talk about Japanese internment camps, not in Quebec anyways. So you're absolutely right. It's not just a university issue that we're missing a Black studies program. We're missing Canadian history, period. We have one stream of Canadian history. And this is why we're having these seminars, because we're systematically excluded. So you're right. I know McGill is in the process. I know there's African studies at McGill. So you can take that certificate at McGill. And there's talks about expansion of a Black studies program. I know that's in the works, very much in the works at McGill. Concordia, I'm not too sure, but I know it's in the works. And I definitely know that you can take it in Halifax, of course, at St. Mary's and St. FX and those places. So I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you.
There are some interesting comments because it is true that even I had no idea about residential schools until I went to university, which is shameful when you think about it. It's and you mentioned it very clearly, that is Canada's dirty secret, pretty much.
Yeah.
And when we talk about it with outsiders or people that are not Canadian, they often tell me like, well, it's pretty much like the apartheid, but just in Canada. I'm like, yep. Pretty much, that's what it is.
Yeah. And it's funny because most people don't realize that these schools only closed about 20, 25 years ago. It wasn't that long ago. And so we are, again, it just goes to speak that we're not having spaces. Like I see it here, like Catherine Diallo says, I just came here and didn't know we had a rich Black history. And so this goes back to the whole lecture. And again, I want to stress, I don't like to lecture, I like to interact. I'm a teacher. We we are having a space right now. And that's why I didn't want to focus on the history, just the amuse-bouche. We are having a Black space. Every time you gather together, we are having a Black space. We need to have those Black spaces. We need to. And it's geographical, it's mental, it's physical. We need to put, and also let's be honest, we need to put our money where our mouth is. We need to buy Black, we need to support Black, and we need to build Black. So you can take that quote for tonight. We need to buy Black, support Black, and build Black. Because again, like Tanya and I were discussing, no one's going to do it for us. If we wait for the government to do things for us, then good luck. But instead, we need to be the William Browns and the William Arnolds of the world and be pioneers and build for ourselves. I know that there are things happening in Nova Scotia that we need to be emulating contextually and locally in each of our provinces. This is not a Nova Scotian thing. They're just ahead of us on some levels, Julie. But we need to build, and we need to do it for ourselves. We need as a community to collectively decide, put our differences aside, collectively decide this is important, and dig along and build along somebody that you may not agree with philosophically, but ultimately you agree on this goal. And that's very important to me because I work alongside people I don't agree with every day, but the goal is important. And the goal for me is that I don't want my daughters to see the N-word in a textbook. I don't want my daughters not to have a place to go to. I grew up I was mentored through the NDG Black Community Center. That space doesn't exist anymore. I want to go someplace. I want my children to know they matter, they count, and they are here. So back to stamping, right? We are here. So I see Hasina agrees. Thank you, Hasina.
And you know, it's very interesting the way you said it, because it is true that I am half white Canadian and half Senegalese, right? But I was born and raised on the I guess in Hull, next to Ottawa. I came here and I lived in different West African countries, but my only real tie to my Blackness is my Senegalese tie. And I think I never really acknowledged or knew that there was such thing as an African or Black Canadian history. And as you said it, like we need to pull together to have those conversations so that there's legacy even for my own children that they can then get back on and look back and be proud of at the end of the day, right? To create our own identity and stick together.
Yeah. And I think that's a conversation. I see Tia Collins is our future Dr. Tia Collins, I have to say. I think it's very, very important that we do talk about our divides. And I think it's like, you know, you're in, like I said, you're in a family, you know, I'll be honest, sorry, Mom. I don't like everybody in my family, Julie, I don't, but we're family. And that means we have a direction to go in together. And that means whether I like you or not, you are here and you're my brother and my sister. And, you know, we have things to do. We can talk about the disagreement after, but right now we have a job to do. So we need to put the pettiness aside, the egos aside, put the money in and build. Because if not, no one is going to do it for us. And that's the point I want to stress right now. No one's going to do it for us. I think Tia here is talking about this disconnect that we have with the diaspora. I'm very interested in connecting with the diaspora. Of course, it's on a personal level. I recently got married, Julie, and my husband is Ghanaian.
Oh.
And I'm jealous. I'm jealous because they know more about themselves than we do. So let that sink in. They know more about themselves than we do. And just to let you know, Julie, my African DNA, it's Senegalese, so we're sisters, but we were sisters already.
We can chat more about the Senegal. Like Senegal.
Yes. Yeah, but I'm like, I'm jealous sometimes because their history, when I talk to my husband with Kwame Ture and Nkrumah, their history starts not with slavery. It starts about the foundation of their country and their tribes and the languages. That's why I have the Ndenkra behind us for strength. But our history in Canada, they like to stamp, oh, we were enslaved people. That's not my beginning. That's not my beginning. And we need to change that narrative, and no one's going to do it for us. We are going to do it. So again, I know Dorothy Williams, Aquila's, thank you for putting your thing on here. And I'm ready to do the Black tour, right? I'm ready to do the Black tour. I see, I think they're all talking and connecting.
Yeah,
Julie.
yeah, exactly. And I was even thinking that,
see.
like, let's do the Black tour across Canada. We should probably have the same thing that they do in the States, where they go back to the continent
Yes.
to just get to know about your history, because we all know, well, approximately from which country slaves were deported from. Right?
Exactly.
So I mean, this is something
Exactly.
that would be mandatory, just to solidify the idea of like having
exactly.
identity.
At some point, we need to take, you know, and of course, you know, Nova Scotia has a very strong history with the diaspora, given that there was the Back to Africa thing, and then the Marcus Garvey, the Back to African movement, right? And Nova Scotia, Nova Scotians have found relatives in Sierra Leone because of their connection, right? So yes, let's do Black Canada tour, and then we go. Black Canada finds their friends in Africa, their brothers and sisters in Africa. But again, the stressing point of this is Black spaces, and Black spaces happen when we put Black efforts forward. Again, we are not in the business of waiting. We are in the business of creating. Buy Black, support Black, build Black. These Black spaces will not happen without our Black bodies, our Black voices, and putting aside our Black differences. Okay? So this is very important, putting aside our Black differences and building our Black spaces. And again, when I say Black, let's be very, very clear. I don't want people to say, oh, I'm not Black enough. You define yourself as Black, you're Black enough. Okay, you're Black. That's how I see it. I'm mixed race myself, and no one can tell me that I'm not Black. People who know me on this chat know. I see Sima has a question. Sorry.
Yes, I just wanted to make a comment. You know, my parents were from Uganda. I was born in Canada, Saskatchewan. And, you know, I never really knew a lot about Black history until I started reading about it on my own. I didn't know there was KKK in Saskatchewan. I didn't know that Black cowboys from Oklahoma settled in Alberta, where I lived as well. I didn't know about the descendants of slaves settling around Chatham and Africville, etc. These are things I didn't know in the education system. I mean, the CBC a few years ago gave us, like, you know, the Book of Negroes, the TV series. I didn't know, like, if the Underground Railroad ended in Canada, why weren't we learning about this? Where's the pride? And back to, you know, my alma mater is Ottawa U, and I got an email today about that N-word issue. And again, growing up, there was a big narrative in this country that racism doesn't exist. You heard Doug Ford say it, and he recanted. Francois Legault said similar things about that. And then when we had this debate with regards to the N-word at Ottawa U, you heard a lot of, you know, white politicians and white people, you know, speaking on this issue and claiming academic freedom. And you didn't see many, you know, people of color other than students that came out, or prominent people like, you know, politicians, etc., commenting on that issue. I mean, I think this is a big issue. Not even like the most, I think, far-right politicians in the States would say the N-word as academic freedom. So, I mean, Canada does have, I love Canada, don't get me wrong, but, you know, there, you can go around. For my whole life, I would hear people say, hey, there's no racism here. This is a perfect.
Yeah, good luck with that.
Residential.
You know, it's interesting that you bring that up, Seema, because I tend to think of Canada as the polite racist or the covert racist. Sometimes I'd rather deal with the Americans because they just tell you. Canada is interesting, right? It's very interesting. But what's also interesting is that you said that you won't even see the far right wing politicians use the N-word. And here's what I'm glad you brought this in, because tonight was my hot button topic. Seema, I was very upset today. I had to do some meditation, which those of you know, I don't like it, but I needed to, because I was angry, because I said, you know, words are so important. And we've taken a lot of words out of our vocabulary. You know, when it comes to our LGBTQA plus ally community, we've taken words out of our vocabulary. When it comes to mental health, we've taken words out of our vocabulary. when it comes to our brothers and sisters in our Jewish communities, in our Asian communities. We've taken those words out of play. But this word, the N word, seems to be something that we want to hold on to. And I question the motivation of the desire to hold on to this word. This word is not in play. It is no longer for anyone's use. No academic freedom. You can say the N word. Why is this becoming a debate? It's out of play, period. Period. And I'm not quite sure why people are holding on to their academic freedom. No, it's out of play. But you know how that happens, how we make it out of play? Everybody on this chat, if you have a child that's out of school, email their commissioner, email the government, it's out of play. So Seema, that's a good question. I'm not sure why this word is they're so desiring to hold on to it, unless it's a way of trying to remind us what you think our place is. And that I'm not accepting.
Well, I think part of it is when you hear it repeated in the music, and hip hop. I think it was growing up. It was good to see Black people make money and become successful. But again, a lot of the albums were sold mostly to white suburbs. They don't get necessarily pulled.
You're
over
right.
profile, but they can. So when people hear they repeat the word, they're like, "Well, I'm repeating a song." Well, because we do hear it every day. And so I think that causes. And it makes. I'm not white, but I try and think of myself. What would a white person feel? And what would they think? And I could understand if they're hearing in every song, it's mainstream, and then it's being repeated everywhere. You're in the club, you hear it, but they can't say it. Then I think that causes a lot of conflict.
But you know what, Seema? That's what I'm saying. Like, this is we need to have a family conversation then, right? Because for Black folks, we need to have a conversation about what we're perpetuating out. But in the meantime, while we're having this dialogue, you still can't say it. It's out of play.
I agree. And another issue, to quote Dr. Cornel West, he said, what happens when you see Black faces in high places? It's like, for example, in Ottawa, they put a Black police chief. Toronto, the Black police chief resigned, etc. You could say Obama, whatever. But, people always say, hey, how are those people supposed to navigate? Because on one hand, they have they're bringing the burden of a whole community, but sometimes if they're, police chief, they have to police entire communities. So it's almost like they're stuck in a place. People might say, oh, they forgot the community, or, how do they also survive too? Because if they're usually in those high places, they might be the only one, and they kind of have to navigate. So I think that's something that, have to figure out how, we could make sure that when we get people in those type of positions, that,
and that they have the support of their community, right?
Yeah.
Because you're right. Like, I'm in a high place now, but there's times I have to worry about what I say, Seema. I have to worry, right? I'm a teacher. I represent my school board. But at some point, I've developed my allyship. And at some point, we need to support our folks that are in these high spaces. Here's the thing that my mom used to tell me. If she's on the line, she'll tell you. She will tell me all this. You can argue at home, but we don't do that in public. And we have a tendency to air out our dirty business in public. If you have things to say about your people, let's do this in private. Let's have a conversation. But that divisiveness, that opportunity to put each other down publicly, I'm not in that. Like I said, we can have different philosophies, but if we have a goal of working together, I can put that aside and work on that goal. But I'm not about to embarrass my people out in public when I disagree with something. I can take them aside and have that conversation. That's I feel like we need to have conversations with ourselves. And that's another fundamental reason. It's not just we need to stamp ourselves. We need to talk like we're doing right now. We need to talk. We need to have conversations. Like you're saying, Seema, how do we expect white people not to want to say the N-word if we're out there putting it out as pop music? We need to talk. In the meantime, you still can't say it. But we need to talk, and we don't do that, right? We don't have a space and an opportunity to have dialogues. And that's why one of my research stuff, to go back to my academic life, is purposeful dialogue. I don't like to talk just to talk. I want to talk with a purpose. We can agree to disagree in mutuality, love, and admiration, and keep it moving. And I would still support you, Seema. That's me. Because I understand that if I want my people to move forward, there's some things that I need to put aside. My ego is not bigger than my people. And I really am desperate for those conversations and spaces. So, and I believe Canada is a good country, but you know, when I got married, Seema, you got to love the good and the bad and the ugly. And if you can love Canada in the ugly, we're good. But Canada needs to admit that they got ugly. I see a lot of chat, a lot of connecting going on here.
Yes, yes. I think we will probably have to allow people to be able to communicate with each other.
Yeah, I see here. Oh, we're talking about the tour. Where somebody wants a virtual tour. Okay.
Yeah, during COVID, right? Yeah, there's a lot of exchange also of I guess what their parents told them as well. Like as you mentioned, talking to your elders about what was happening, what was in their curriculum, and yeah, things that are shocking.
Yeah, very shocking. And seeing a lot of sharing. You see, we're testifying. We're testifying. We're stamping. We're making our space. These are stories that we would have never heard if we had not had a platform tonight. Right? We need a platform. So we need a tour. We need a Black library. And now we need a virtual talking space until COVID is over. So I'm just a connector. I'm not really great, and I have many projects, but I want to be on the Black tour. So those of you who are entrepreneurs, let's do the Black tour. Let's do the COVID tour. Let's build up the Black library. Let's build up virtual Black spaces. Let's chat. Let's do this. Like, and so here's the thing. We're all excited now. The momentum's going to drop. Don't forget about it. Reach out to somebody that you just met. Exchange emails on this chat privately. Reach out to someone. You know, when you're together, it's a Black space. Julie and I are now sisters through Senegal and Canada. We have a Black space. Seema's my brother. We have a Black space. I see Zoe and Darnella and Catherine are out there making Black. Like, this is what we need. We need to talk. And again, like-mindedness doesn't always create results. It's okay to be different to create. Like I said, I'm sure William Arnold and William Brown did not agree about Africville and everything. I'm sure Nora Hendricks had some pushback on the Fountain Chapel Church. I'm sure the NCC, when it was in decline or being built, they had disagreements. But these spaces were built because they had a greater goal and a greater purpose. And I want that greater purpose. That's great Black space. Okay. Are there any other questions in the chat? I hate when I'm talking a lot.
No, there was just some testimony. One of them from Zoe was that she was talking to Donalda, saying that she went to camp a few hours north of Montreal in the 90s, and there were little Black men lantern holding statues on some of the lawns in rural Quebec. And she's asking if maybe we can rip some of those out on the tour.
Yes, I'm sure we can have a smashing tour. A smashing tour. I see Canada has great marketing. You know what's interesting, Catherine? Canada does have great marketing, but you'll only see in the Vancouver airport Indigenous people. Every other airport in this country, you're not seeing us. You're not. I find it crazy. You're not seeing us. The other day I was giving a workshop and I said, one of the fundamental problems that I have in Canada is that they don't want me to feel like I belong. I'm just Canadian by default. I just happen to be born here. But yeah, what they don't realize is that my own doctor says, oh, well, where are you from? What are you talking about? My mother's 10th generation Nova Scotian. I am Black Canadian, maybe more Canadian than you are. But those little microaggressions, those little gaslighting, it gives me the impression that I don't belong. And you know what? I kind of agree with Seema on this level. It may not be entirely their fault. That comes down to who we see on television and the narrative and what we see. And that's where we have to cut. Black spaces, folks. Black spaces.
You know what another thing is? Another thing, I love Canada. Like I'm born here. I relate probably more with old stock Canadians than I do with a lot of people. But another thing, like hockey, they say it's our national sport. But it's just not very inclusive. If you're Black, Indigenous, you get like Kevin Weeks was talking about the GTHL. Like, it's not a place. Like, growing up, I didn't feel comfortable, playing hockey and things like that. And even when you do, like it just constant, ridicule, chants. And I know there's more people of color playing the game. And if Canada becomes more diverse, especially in Toronto, if they want to remain dominant at hockey, they're going to have to open up to different demographics.
And I'm glad you brought that up. 2 of my cousins play for minor leagues in Canada and in hockey, and their stories. I mean, there's people from Nova Scotia who played hockey that I like, they're like uncles to me, and their stories are horrific. Right? Because of course, only basketball and football are for us, right? Like you didn't know, you didn't get the memo, but that's only for us. But you're right. Like if you want us to buy into the Canadianness, I need to see myself. That's it. Well, I teach at a school where I could say hand on heart that the kid who walks into our school sees themselves in a teacher. And that's important. That's important. I know Gail is on the line. Gail and I went to Row West together. The only Black person we saw, Seema, was our janitor. I didn't have a Black professor until I went to John Abbott. Right? So we need to see ourselves. And it's really, oh, right. And so Kadeen, I don't know if there's any Black teachers at Row West. So are there any other questions? Yes, he was the best janitor ever. You're right, Tanya, he was. Are there any other questions?
No, there's no other questions.
I would encourage everyone here to use the private part of your chat, connect with someone. My email is available. I don't want to say I'm a public figure, but my email is public. It's snjafrali@gmail.com. Those of you who are interested in these ideas, let's do this. Let's get together. Let's put our heads together. I'm looking for people who are willing, and I'll be honest, Julie, people who are like, I may not like you, but I like the goal.
Mm-hmm.
That's important to me. We have to have mutual admiration and respect, even if we disagree, but we have a goal. And maybe next time we'll be on here with Balarama and Montreal en Action talking about our Black tour.
Yes.
Our Black Canadian Space Black tour. Let's do this, folks. Let's do this.
Putting it out in the universe.
Thank you, Laverne. And Laverne, thank you so much for coming on Shout Out. Her cousin was the first Black hockey player, Willie O'Ray, from New Brunswick.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for allowing this space, really.
Thank you.
And for encouraging everyone to participate in it. And while we are here, before we part ways with all this wisdom and these call to actions, I just want to, first thank everyone for being here. And would like also take a moment to thank everyone who has given us a donation, no matter how big or small, to support those webinars and educational programming. As we saw, these are not available to anywhere really. So this is even more important to create those Black spaces and those conversations. Our webinars are open to the general public and they're free because we are dedicated to raising public awareness on issues related to systemic discrimination and racism to instigate change. And also all donations generated through our webinars here are reinvested into our educational programming, allowing us to continue to offer you quality content and sessions and training that respond to today's pressing issue. And once again, the webinar will be shared on our platform. And also don't forget to fill in the automated survey that will be sent to you after the webinar.
And I'm gonna call out for everyone, let's come back in a year and let's make sure we talk about our Black tour. Mm-hmm. Let's do this, folks, let's do this. I'm all about that stuff. So thank you so much. I sent a message. Thank you for each one of you for taking the time on the screen. I know we have technological fatigue and sharing this time, letting me into your space and entering to mine. I appreciate this. I appreciate the dialogue, the backspace. Thank you to Balarama, Montreal en Action. I appreciate our organization. I know one of our executive directors on here, Alice, thank you so much for thinking of me. I appreciate all of you for sharing your energy with me. And I really hope that a year from now, November 2021, we are going to be talking about the launch of our Black tour. So thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you so much again. And